A mud-splattered traveling bag hit the stone steps of Greystone Manor before the gatekeeper could even raise his hand to stop her. The young woman who dropped it did not flinch. She did not apologize. She reached into her coat, pulled out a sealed letter, and held out with the kind of steadiness that made the old gatekeeper forget what he was supposed to say. Now, you have to understand something about the Duke of Greyvale. This was a man who had turned away for noble families in 2 seasons. Daughters of earls, nieces of viscounts, women with land and dowries, and perfectly rehearsed smiles. He rejected every single one without a second look. The whole society had stopped sending their best. They said he was cold. They said he was broken. Honestly, most of them were right. So when word reached his study that a woman with no title, no chaperone, and a cracked carriage was standing at his gate, holding a letter stamped with his dead father's seal, the logical thing was to send her away immediately. His steward delivered the message. The Duke turned from the window, heard every word, and said, "She does not come in, but that letter, that seal." 11 years of silence folded into one envelope, and now it was sitting in his gatekeeper's hand, in the cold morning air. Some debts do not wait for permission. Do you think a man like this deserves a second chance, or has he already made his choice? Tell us where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because this story is only just beginning. The letter landed on the Duke's mahogany desk with a sound that made his steward, Mr. Braith, flinch. Duke Harken of Greyvale did not look at it immediately. He stood at the study window with both hands behind his back, watching 3 horses cross the frost-covered lower yard. The hedgerows had gone white overnight. The morning light was thin and gray. He watched the horses the way a man watches things when he is really thinking about something else entirely. "You said she gave no family name," he said. "None, Your Grace." Mr. Braith stood very still near the door, the way experienced servants learn to stand when the Duke was in a difficult mood. "She gave only her given name, Lettie, and the letter." Harken turned from the window and looked at the envelope on his desk. The seal was unmistakable, a hawk in flight above a split shield. The personal seal of his late father, Duke Aldous of Greyvale, died 11 years ago. Harken had not seen that seal on anything since the solicitors came to read the will. He had not expected to see arrive at his gate in the hand of an unknown young woman with a broken carriage and no chaperone. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded a single sheet in his father's familiar slanted hand. He read it once, then he read it again. When he set it down, his expression had not changed, but his jaw had tightened noticeably. "Bring her in," he said. Mr. Braith blinked. In 17 years of service, he had watched the Duke turn away for prospective brides, 2 cousins seeking loans, 1 ambassador's aide, and a visiting bishop. He had never once heard him say those 3 words after a gate inquiry. "Your Grace." "The East sitting room, Braith. Give her something warm. Ask Mrs. Pendle about her coat." He turned back to the window. "And tell no one in the household who she is." "Not yet." Mr. Braith left without another word. Down at the gate, Lettie Crane had not moved from where old Tomas, the gatekeeper, had asked her to wait. She stood on the stone path just inside the iron gates, her traveling bag at her feet, hands folded in front of her. The cold was sharp, and the wind cut through her coat steadily. Her nose had gone pink. She had not complained, and she had not paced. She had spent the last several minutes watching a small bird work methodically at the frozen ivy on the left gate post, pulling at it with the kind of stubborn patience that made the entire effort look both hopeless and admirable. She understood that feeling well. Old Tomas watched her from under his hat brim. In 30 years at these gates, he had seen every kind of woman arrive hoping to reach the Duke. Most came in polished carriages with footmen and expressions like paintings. This one had come with a cracked wheel and a steady gaze, and something in that stillness bothered him in a way he could not quite name. When Mr. Braith came down the path, Lettie's face did not brighten with relief or sag with tension releasing. She simply nodded once, picked up her own bag before Braith could offer, and walked toward the manor as if she had been fully prepared for exactly this outcome. Mrs. Pendle, the housekeeper, met them at the side entrance. She was a compact woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an excellent memory. She had managed Greyvale through 2 difficult winters, a fever outbreak in the kitchens, and the Duke's catastrophic broken engagement 4 years prior. She was not easily unsettled, but she looked at this young woman, plainly dressed and clearly exhausted from travel, and something shifted quietly in her chest. Greyvale had seen a great deal of careful performance in recent years. Women who smiled at exactly the right moment, who chose their words with the precision of someone who had rehearsed them the previous evening. This one had not performed anything. She had simply arrived and been herself. And that, in Mrs. Pendle's long experience, was the most unusual thing a person could do in a duke's house. "You must be frozen through," Mrs. Pendle said. Her tone was genuine. Lettie thanked her, handed over her coat, and asked simply if there was somewhere to sit. Mrs. Pendle brought her to the east sitting room, the smaller of the reception rooms, warmer than most, with a fire that drew well. A tea tray arrived before it was requested. Lettie poured her own cup, wrapped both hands around it, and drank. For one unguarded moment, Mrs. Pendle, standing just outside the doorway, watched her and thought, "This one is different." She could not have explained it to anyone's satisfaction, but she had worked in this house through its best and worst years, and some instincts needed no name to be trusted. Upstairs, Harken read the letter a 3rd time. It was not sentimental. His father had not been a sentimental man. It was a plain statement of obligation. 11 years ago, when the Crane family collapsed financially following the death of their father, Aldous of Greyvale had entered a private arrangement. The eldest Crane daughter, then 12 years old, had been promised a place under protection of the Greyvale name when she came of age, not as a servant, not as a formal ward, as a sponsored companion, with rights of residence and provision, and if the sitting duke saw fit, consideration for an honorable match within the household social circle. All this had died before the arrangement was ever enacted. Harken had known nothing of it until this morning. The thought settled in his chest in a way he could not simply move past. His father had been a man of careful honor and serious obligation. He would not have made such a promise lightly, and he would not have expected his son to walk away from it. He folded the letter and placed it inside his coat, close to his ribs, the way you keep something that requires a decision you are not yet ready to make. He walked toward the east wing and stopped outside the sitting room door. Through the half-open gap, he could see Lettie seated near the fire, looking into flames with the kind of expression people only wear when they believe nobody is watching. It was not sadness exactly. It was something older, something that had already passed through grief and came out the other side as a quiet, settled resolve. Harken stood there longer than he intended to. Then he pushed the door open and walked in. Lettie looked up without startling. She rose immediately, because manners were something she had been raised with even after everything else had been taken away. "Your Grace," she said. "Sit down," he replied, not unkindly. Directly, he remained standing with his back to the window, using the light behind the way he always did in difficult conversations. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither spoke for a long moment. "You came alone," he said. "There was no one else to come," she answered. It was not a bid for sympathy. It was simply true, and she delivered the way she seemed to deliver most things, without any attempt to soften or inflate the reality of it. Harken studied her face. She was not what society called a great beauty. She was not dressed to impress. But there was something in the quality of her stillness, in the directness of her gaze, that made the usual assessments he ran in these moments feel less useful than they normally did. "My father made a promise he did not live to keep," he said. "Yes," she replied, "and you have come to hold me to it." She met his eyes fully. I have come because I had nowhere else to go. Whether you honor it is entirely your choice, your grace. I am not here to force your hand." He said nothing. She did not fill the silence. Most people could not sit quietly in a room with the Duke. They rushed to fill it nervously, offering more than was asked. Lettie Crane simply let the silence be what it was. Outside, frost was beginning to melt where the morning sun reached the upper garden wall. A crow landed on the stone ledge beyond the window, looked in for a moment and flew away. The clock on the mantel moved one careful minute forward, and Harken, Duke of Greyvale, a man who had turned away every woman society had placed before him, stood in his own sitting room and found, for the first time in a very long while, that he did not know what to say next. The news that a young woman had been admitted to Greyvale Manor moved through the household like fire through dry grass. By the time Lettie Crane had finished her second cup of tea, 3 kitchen maids, the under-butler, and both upstairs footmen knew something unusual was happening. Mrs. Pendle had issued strict instructions for silence, which meant nothing except that the speculation grew louder in the parts of the house she could not hear. The most dramatic theory came from a kitchen maid named Polly, who said with absolute conviction that the young woman was a secret daughter of the late Duke. The under-butler, a careful thin man named Mr. Seal, dismissed this with a look. A second kitchen maid, a quiet girl named Bess, said nothing at all, but she was the one who noticed that the east sitting room fire had been built higher than usual, and that 2 cups had been set on the tea tray instead of 1. She kept that observation to herself, which showed considerably more wisdom than either of the others. What none of them could have predicted was that by midday, the Duke had still not dismissed his visitor. That alone was extraordinary. Harken had returned to his study after leaving the sitting room and spent 40 minutes calling for no one. He read the letter one final time, watched the grounds crew chip ice in the upper fountain, then called for Mr. Braith. "What do we know of the Crane family?" he said. Mr. Braith had anticipated the question and made quiet inquiries since early morning. The father was a Mr. Silas Crane, a minor landowner in the northern counties. He died 12 years ago under difficult financial circumstances. The estate was sold to cover debts. There were 3 children, 2 older sons and the youngest, a daughter. He paused. The sons emigrated to the continent some years ago. There has been no contact with them since. So she is entirely without family. Entirely, Your Grace. And the letter, does it have legal standing? Mr. Braith chose his words carefully. I have sent a rider to Mr. Fawcett's office this morning, your father's former solicitor. If the arrangement was formally recorded, it will stand. If it was a private agreement only, the question becomes more complicated. We should have clarity by tomorrow. She stays until then. Mr. Braith nodded once. What he did not say, and what Harken did not ask, was a more pressing social question sitting heavily between them. What would it mean for an unmarried young woman of no title to spend even one night at Greyvale Manor without a formal position or explanation in their world? That question had exactly one answer, and that answer would travel between households within 30 miles before the week was out. But Harken was already at the door, and Mr. Braith had learned across 17 years that a closing door meant the conversation had ended on the Duke's terms. Lettie was given a room in the east wing, 2 doors from the library. Mrs. Pendle chose it deliberately because the east wing received morning light, and she felt this particular young woman needed it, though she could not have given anyone a satisfying reason why. The room was clean and considerably larger than anything Lettie had lived in since her girlhood. She stood in the middle of it for a moment after the housemaid left, pressed her palms flat against her skirt, and breathed. She had not allowed herself to think about what would happen if the Duke had said no. She had saved the carriage fare across 8 careful months, found a letter among the last of her father's remaining papers, and fixed her mind entirely on the act of arriving. What came after arriving had been held at a careful arm's length for weeks. She could not hold it there any longer. She was here. She was inside. There was a fire burning in the grate and morning light coming through clean glass, and for one long moment, that was enough. She unpacked with quiet efficiency. A spare dress, a writing box, a book of verse, its spine held together with a length of ribbon, and a portrait of her mother, no larger than a man's hand, a kind face with the same eyes Letty saw in every mirror. She set it carefully on the windowsill and looked at it for one long, still moment. Then came the footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, stopping just outside her door. A pause that suggested a decision being made. Then a knock. The Duke stood alone in the corridor with no attendant beside him. He looked briefly at the room, at the sparse possessions, at the portrait on the sill, and then at her. "There are things we need to establish," he said. "I agree," she replied. He was not accustomed to agreement arriving that quickly. Most people in his presence waited to understand the direction of his thinking before committing to anything. This woman had agreed before he had said anything she could meaningfully assess. He noted that carefully and said nothing about it. "While Mr. Fawcett reviews the arrangement, you remain here as a guest of the household. You take meals in the east dining room. You will not be introduced to any visiting party until the legal question is settled." He paused. "Is that acceptable?" "It is." "You are very calm about all of this." She considered that for a moment. "I have had 3 weeks on the road to adjust to the idea of arriving. You have had 3 hours. I imagine that accounts for the difference." Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not a smile, but not nothing either. 3 hours is accurate, he said. "You have not asked me anything about myself yet," she observed. Not as a complaint. Simply as a fact she was placing in the air between them. "I will." He looked past her at the portrait on the windowsill. "Your mother?" "Yes. She is gone. 3 years ago." He nodded once, the way a person nods when they understand a loss they will not press further into. Then he said, "The library is 2 doors from here. You are welcome to use it." He turned and walked back down the corridor before she could respond. She stood in the open doorway watching him go, straight-backed and measured, giving nothing away in his posture or his pace. And she thought something that surprised her with his clarity. This man is not cold. He is careful. There is an enormous difference between the two, and most of the world has spent years confusing them. The afternoon brought a visitor nobody had prepared for. A carriage arrived at the front gates bearing the crest of Lord Dunmore Spelton, a broad, determined man of 60 who sat on a county magistrate board and was a father of Miss Harriet Spelton, the most recent noble bride the Duke had declined to receive. Lord Spelton had 4 daughters still requiring suitable arrangements and a social reputation that ran entirely on the currency of information. He had heard something through the servant network that morning, a groom who had spoken to a kitchen girl, and he had made the drive to Greyvale with a deliberate and specific purpose. Mr. Braith met him in the entrance hall. "His Grace is not receiving visitors this afternoon," Mr. Braith said, in the even tone of a man who had given that exact answer more times than he could count. "He will receive me," Lord Spelton said flatly. "He will not, my lord. I am sorry." Lord Spelton's eyes moved past Braith toward the staircase, and then deliberately toward the east corridor. He stood very still for a long moment, listening to the house. There was a fire burning in a room that had not been used in some time. A tea tray being carried by a housemaid toward the east wing. The small but unmistakable disturbance of a household quietly adjusting to an unexpected presence. He read those signs with the accuracy of a man who had spent his entire life in great houses and knew exactly what they meant. "I will leave my card," he said at last. He placed it down, remained in the entrance hall 30 seconds longer than was strictly necessary with his eyes fixed on the east corridor, and then returned to his carriage without another word. Mr. Braith closed the door and turned to find Harken standing at the top of the stairs, watching. "He will talk," Mr. Braith said. "He was already going to talk about something," Harken replied. "This or the roads or the grain prices. It is of no consequence to me." "It may be of consequence to the young lady's reputation, your grace." Harken said nothing to that. He looked toward the east corridor for a long moment, then back at Braith. Then he walked back toward his study, and the particular set his shoulders as he went told Mr. Braith everything the Duke had not put into words. In the east wing, Lettie sat at the small writing desk beside her window with the last thin light of the winter afternoon falling across the floor around her. She had the writing box open. She had not written anything. There were no words yet for what the day had been. There was only the quiet, undeniable fact of it. She had arrived. She had been let in, and a man the entire county called cold had given her a room 2 doors from the library and told her she was welcome to use it. She had grown up watching her father maintain dignity, when dignity was the only thing he had left to maintain. She knew what being careful cost a person. She knew what it meant to guard something deeply and say very little about it. The Duke of Greyvale was guarding something. She had felt at the moment he did not fill the silence either. She closed the writing box, looked out at the frost-covered grounds, and let the thought settle slowly into place. Whatever was being guarded inside this house, she was now inside its walls. And that changed things, quietly, significantly, in ways she could not yet fully see. It changed everything. The library at Greyvale was the kind of room that took a moment to fully enter. Lettie stood in the doorway the following morning with her hand on the frame, looking at walls lined floor to ceiling with books that had clearly been read rather than arranged for decoration. Several were shelved imperfectly, spines tilted at slight angles the way books land when someone puts them back in a hurry. A globe near the fireplace sat slightly off its axis from being frequently turned. The writing table beside the window had ink stains on the left side, the kind that build slowly over months of consistent use. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes, kneeling near the lowest shelf reading titles along the history section. When the door opened without a knock, Harken stopped when he saw her. She rose quickly. He stood in the doorway in a plain coat with no cravat properly tied, clearly not dressed for receiving anyone. This was a man who came to this room privately and had not expected to find it occupied. "I was told the household was still at breakfast," he said. "I eat early," she replied. "I am sorry. I will leave." "Sit down." The same 2 words as the day before, the same direct tone. He moved to the writing table and opened a particular drawer, removing a folded document he stood looking at for a moment. Lettie returned to the shelf and did not watch him. She understood that this room was part of his private mourning, and she had no intention of disturbing it simply by existing in it. She pulled a book from the shelf and opened it. They stayed quiet in the same room for nearly an hour. It was not uncomfortable. It was 2 people occupying a shared space, each absorbed in their own thinking, and the fire between them had settled from crackling to a low, steady burn. "You read history," he said. He had been watching her, without fully meaning to. "My father thought it the most useful education a person could receive," she said. "He used to say that if you understood what people had already done, you stood some chance of understanding what they were about to do." A pause settled between them. He sounded like a careful man. He was. And then life asked things of him that carefulness alone could not answer. She turned a page without looking up. I think that was what broke him in the end. Not the losses themselves. The surprise of them. Harken set the document down. He looked at her. She was looking at the book. "I was not prepared for anything I felt yesterday," he said. The words arrived as though they had been sitting at the edge of his thoughts, and simply stepped forward without permission. She looked up then. Feeling something does not commit you to any particular course of action, she said carefully. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, but not nothing either. That is a very measured response, he said. You are a very measured person, she replied. It seemed appropriate. When Mr. Braith appeared at the door 40 minutes later with news that Mr. Fawcett had arrived from the city, Harken rose with the expression of a man returning to a duty he had briefly and unusually set aside. He paused at the door. Stay as long as you like, he said, without looking back. Then he was gone. Mr. Fawcett was 73 years old, small in frame, and carried the quiet authority of a man who had outlasted far more powerful people simply by being consistently right. He had been the Greyvale solicitor for 40 years, and had drafted the letter with his own hand at the late Duke's instruction. He remembered every detail of it, without needing to open the file. He sat across from Harken in the study, hands folded over his leather case, and confirmed what the Duke had already begun to suspect. The arrangement was not a private understanding that could be quietly set aside. It had been entered formally in the firm's private register under both family names. It was held entirely. Miss Crane, Mr. Fawcett said, is entitled under the terms of this arrangement to the formal protection of your household. The nature of that protection remains your judgment, but the obligation itself cannot be dissolved. And if I chose not to honor it? Harken asked. Mr. Fawcett looked at him with the patience of a man who had heard difficult questions from powerful people for 4 decades. Your father trusted you to do what was right. He simply did not live long enough to tell you what right looked like in this particular case. A pause followed. I have known you since you were 8 years old, Your Grace. I do not believe you are going to dishonor this. Harken said nothing to that. Is there anything more in the register I should know? One additional note. Fawcett opened his case and placed a single sealed page on the desk. Your father wrote this separately and instructed it be given only once the arrangement was finally enacted. He folded his hands again and looked toward the window while Harken read. The note was 6 lines. It was the most personal thing his father had ever written to him, and it had arrived 11 years later. Harken read it twice and then folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat beside the letter already resting there. Thank you, Fawcett, he said. Those 3 words were all the dismissal the solicitor ever needed. Nobody had anticipated what came an hour later. A second carriage rolled to the greyvale gates shortly after noon bearing no visible crest, which was itself a deliberate choice, because the man inside had a crest and a title that any county household would recognize immediately. Sir Rufus Keld stepped onto the gravel and looked at the manor with the expression of a man quietly calculating what something might eventually be worth. He was 40 years old, lean, well-dressed, and carried an easy smile that required far more hidden effort to maintain than it appeared. He was Harken's cousin to the female line, 3 degrees removed, and under the terms of the Greyvale entailment, the single person who would inherit the title and estate if the Duke died without a legitimate heir. He had spent 4 years carefully watching Greyvale from a comfortable distance, through well-placed conversations at the right clubs and certain dinner tables. He had allowed the rumors about the Duke's impossible nature to grow a little louder than they might have grown on their own. Never enough to be accused of anything, just enough to keep a particular idea alive in the minds of people who mattered. The library at Greyvale was the kind of room that took a moment to fully enter. Lettie stood in the doorway the following morning with her hand on the frame, looking at walls lined floor to ceiling with books that had clearly been read rather than arranged for decoration. Several were shelved imperfectly, spines tilted at slight angles the way books land when someone puts them back in a hurry. A globe near the fireplace sat slightly off its axis from being frequently turned. The writing table beside the window had ink stains on the left side, the kind that build slowly over months of consistent use. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes, kneeling near the lowest shelf reading titles along the history section. when the door opened without a knock. Harken stopped when he saw her. She rose quickly. He stood in the doorway in a plain coat with no cravat properly tied, clearly not dressed for receiving anyone. This was a man who came to this room privately and had not expected to find it occupied. "I was told the household was still at breakfast," he said. "I eat early," she replied. "I am sorry. I will leave." "Sit down." The same two words as the day before, the same direct tone. He moved to the writing table and opened a particular drawer, removing a folded document he stood looking at for a moment. Lettie returned to the shelf and did not watch him. She understood that this room was part of his private mourning, and she had no intention of disturbing it simply by existing in it. She pulled a book from the shelf and opened it. They stayed quiet in the same room for nearly an hour. It was not uncomfortable. It was two people occupying a shared space, each absorbed in their own thinking, and the fire between them had settled from crackling to a low, steady burn. "You read history," he said. He had been watching her, without fully meaning to. "My father thought it the most useful education a person could receive," she said. "He used to say that if you understood what people had already done, you stood some chance of understanding what they were about to do." A pause settled between them. He sounded like a careful man. He was. And then life asked things of him that carefulness alone could not answer. She turned a page without looking up. I think that was what broke him in the end. Not the losses themselves. The surprise of them. Harken set the document down. He looked at her. She was looking at the book. "I was not prepared for anything I felt yesterday," he said. The words arrived as though they had been sitting at the edge of his thoughts, and simply stepped forward without permission. She looked up then. "Feeling something does not commit you to any particular course of action," she said carefully. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, but not nothing either. "That is a very measured response," he said. "You are a very measured person," she replied. It seemed appropriate. When Mr. Braith appeared at the door 40 minutes later with news that Mr. Fawcett had arrived from the city, Harken rose with the expression of a man returning to a duty he had briefly and unusually set aside. He paused at the door. "Stay as long as you like," he said, without looking back. Then he was gone. Mr. Fawcett was 73 years old, small in frame, and carried the quiet authority of a man who had outlasted far more powerful people simply by being consistently right. He had been the Greyvale solicitor for 40 years, and had drafted the letter with his own hand at the late Duke's instruction. He remembered every detail of it, without needing to open the file. He sat across from Harken in the study, hands folded over his leather case, and confirmed what the Duke had already begun to suspect. The arrangement was not a private understanding that could be quietly set aside. It had been entered formally in the firm's private register under both family names. It was held entirely. "Miss Crane," Mr. Fawcett said, "is entitled under the terms of this arrangement to the formal protection of your household. The nature of that protection remains your judgment, but the obligation itself cannot be dissolved. And if I chose not to honor it?" Harken asked. Mr. Fawcett looked at him with the patience of a man who had heard difficult questions from powerful people for 4 decades. "Your father trusted you to do what was right. He simply did not live long enough to tell you what right looked like in this particular case." A pause followed. "I have known you since you were 8 years old, Your Grace. I do not believe you are going to dishonor this." Harken said nothing to that. "Is there anything more in the register I should know?" One additional note. Fawcett opened his case and placed a single sealed page on the desk. "Your father wrote this separately and instructed it be given only once the arrangement was finally enacted." He folded his hands again and looked toward the window while Harken read. The note was 6 lines. It was the most personal thing his father had ever written to him, and it had arrived 11 years later. Harken read it twice and then folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat beside the letter already resting there. "Thank you, Fawcett," he said. Those 3 words were all the dismissal the solicitor ever needed. Nobody had anticipated what came an hour later. A second carriage rolled to the greyvale gates shortly after noon bearing no visible crest, which was itself a deliberate choice, because a man inside had a crest and a title that any county household would recognize immediately. Sir Rufus Kell stepped onto the gravel and looked at the manor with the expression of a man quietly calculating what something might eventually be worth. He was 40 years old, lean, well-dressed, and carried an easy smile that required far more hidden effort to maintain than it appeared. He was Harken's cousin to the female line, 3 degrees removed, and under the terms of the greyvale entailment, the single person who would inherit the title and estate if the Duke died without a legitimate heir. He had spent 4 years carefully watching Greyvale from a comfortable distance, through well-placed conversations at the right clubs and certain dinner tables. He had allowed the rumors about the Duke's impossible nature to grow a little louder than they might have grown on their own. Never enough to be accused of anything, just enough to keep a particular idea alive in the minds of people who mattered. And now, without any warning, an unknown woman had been let inside those gates. Sir Rufus had made the drive from the city in under 3 hours. Mr. Braith opened the door and delivered his standard answer. Sir Rufus smiled in a way that acknowledged the response without accepting it. "Tell him I am not here on business. Simply passing through to Holt. I will wait 3 minutes in the entrance hall." He was already inside before Braith had composed a refusal. Harken came down the stairs with the look of a man who had expected this visit to arrive eventually, and found its timing particularly irritating. Sir Rufus opened his arms slightly, as if greeting someone he genuinely missed. "Cousin, you look well. You are not passing through to Holt," Harken said. "Holt is in the opposite direction." Rufus smiled without adjusting it by a single fraction. "Then I will be honest. I heard the county was talking. I came to see if there was anything family might do to help." "There is nothing. There is a young woman in the east wing," Rufus said, the same pleasant tone unbroken as river water over stone. "Lord Spelton told 2 households before his carriage reached home yesterday. By tonight it will reach 4 more. He tilted his head slightly. "I am not here to cause trouble. Harken, I am here because family should manage these things before they become complicated." "I see." Harken descended the final step and stood level with him. "Then I will manage it. You may return to wherever you have actually come from." Rufus made a gesture of easy surrender, said something brief about the frost on the North Road, and left with the same pleasantness he had arrived with. The door closed. Harken stood very still in the entrance hall, looking at nothing in particular. "Double the gate watch tonight," he told Braith. Braith went immediately. What Harken did not know was that Sir Rufus had not left the grounds when his carriage rolled out through the gates. He had stopped at the far end of the Greyvale lane, sent his driver forward, and walked back along the eastern boundary wall on foot, using a narrow footpath that ran parallel to the hedgerow. He had walked that particular path before, at different hours, for different purposes. He reached the section near the old East Garden and stopped. Lord Spelton was already waiting there. The 2 men had met before, twice in London, once at a county assembly during the previous winter. They share a common and very practical interest. Both stood to gain considerably if the Duke of Greyvale's standing in society continued to fall. Spelton's daughter Harriet had been the most recent rejection, and the humiliation had not softened with time or distance. Rufus wanted the estate. Spelton wanted the Duke brought to ruin. Their interests ran alongside each other neatly, and required very little formal arrangement between them. "She is nobody," Spelton said in a low voice, his breath visible in the cold air. "No title, no land, no family remaining. A dead man's letter is the whole of what she has. If the arrangement can be proven improperly recorded, she is left with nothing. I already have someone examining the register Rufus replied. Fawcett was thorough. I suspect the document holds. Then we move differently. Spelton turned his collar up against the wind. Her reputation. She arrived alone, without a maid, without any chaperone, without prior arrangement of any kind. She spent the night under his roof with no formal position and no explanation. That story is already moving through the county, without any help from us. We do not need to invent a single word. We simply need it to travel faster and louder than it already is. Rufus was quiet for a moment. If her reputation collapses publicly, he cannot keep her here without confirming every suspicion already circulating. And if he sends her away to protect himself, the broken obligation becomes a matter of public record that she or Fawcett can make impossible to ignore. Let it become public. Spelton said flatly, let every family within 30 miles understand that the Duke of Greyvale kept an unknown girl under his roof with no formal explanation. His standing was already fragile after the broken engagement 4 years ago. This will finish what that started. An estate? An unmarried duke with no heir and no social standing cannot hold Greyvale indefinitely, Spelton said. The entailment does the rest of the work, without us lifting another finger. Rufus looked at the upper east wing windows visible above the garden wall. One room had warm lamplight burning in it. He studied it for a long moment. She is smarter than she appears, he said. There was no warmth in the observation. It was a plain assessment of a man who had identified something in his path and was deciding how seriously to take it. She is nobody, Spelton said again with more firmness this time. Nobody, Rufus replied, managed to get inside those gates when for noble families could not. He turned from the wall and walked back toward the lane without another word. Lord Spelton stood a moment longer, looking at the lit window above the garden, and then he too turned and left. They had not been as quiet as they believed. The east garden had a stone bench pressed into the far corner near the old yew hedge, sheltered on two sides and completely invisible in winter, because nobody expected anyone to sit there when the ground was frozen solid. Lettie had found it that afternoon, while walking to clear her thoughts, drawn naturally to the stillness of that far corner. She had been sitting there, completely still, when both men stopped on the other side of the wall, not 12 feet from where she sat. She had not moved. She had not made a sound. She had listened to every word with the stillness she had learned during the worst years of her life, the years when understanding a room exactly and quickly was the only useful thing available to her. She sat on that bench long after they left. The cold pressed in from all sides and settled into her hands and through her coat. She held perfectly still and thought with the sharp clarity that comes to a person when everything else goes quiet around them. She understood now exactly what she had walked into, not a distant cold man who might gradually soften with time, not an uncertain obligation resolving itself quietly in the background. She was sitting at the center of a calculated effort to destroy the very house that had opened its gate to her, and she was being used as the instrument of that destruction without ever having agreed to any part of it. She could leave. The thought arrived honestly, and she did not push it away. She could write to Mr. Fawcett that very evening, explain everything she had overheard, and remove herself from Greyvale before any further damage attached itself to the Duke's name. That was a careful choice, the wise choice, the kind her father would have recognized and approved. Then she thought about the 6-line note Mr. Fawcett had placed on the desk that morning, the one she had never read, but whose contents had clearly moved a man not easily moved. She thought about a library where two people had managed an hour of shared silence without it becoming uncomfortable between them. She thought about a room 2 doors from that library, clean and warm, where her mother's portrait sat in morning light on a windowsill. She stood up from the bench. She smoothed her skirt with both hands and walked back across the frozen garden without hurrying. She asked the first housemaid. She passed where the Duke could be found at this hour. The girl said the study, Most likely, Lettie thanked her and walked toward the study with the kind of steadiness that has nothing to do with the absence of fear. She had learned that distinction slowly and at considerable personal cost. When you had already lost most things, the only remaining direction was forward. Everything else was simply a slower way of continuing to lose. She knocked on the study door. His voice told her to enter. She opened the door and looked at him directly across the room. "There is something you need to know," she said, "and it cannot wait." Harken set his pen down. He read her face the way he had trained himself over years to read the faces of people who came to him with real urgency against those who came with performed urgency. What he saw now was entirely real. He said nothing and waited. She told him everything, every word, in the exact order she had heard it, with nothing added and nothing softened. She gave him Sir Rufus's words and Lord Spelton's words and the precise calculation both men had made against his name and against hers. She did not interpret. She did not editorialize. She handed him the truth at full length, the way you pass something sharp to someone who knows how to hold it without being cut. When she finished, the room was very still. Harken stood from his desk. He walked to the window and stood with both hands loose at his sides, looking out at the dark frozen grounds, not clasped behind him as they usually were, simply at his sides. Open, it was a smaller posture than his usual one, not weaker, simply different, in a way that said more than his words tended to. The clock on the mantel moved one slow minute forward. Then he turned. There was something in his face she had not seen across the previous 2 days. Not the careful blankness of a man managing what others were permitted to see. Something underneath that management had shifted, and she was close enough in the lamplight to see exactly where it had landed. "You could have left without saying a word," he said. "Yes," she replied. "Why did you not?" She answered without needing to gather the words first. "Because I have spent enough of my life watching good things be undone by people who had no right to touch them. I did not want to watch it happen again when I was in a position to say something and chose to stay quiet instead." He held her gaze for a long, unhurried moment. Outside the study window, the ground of Greyvale lay dark and frozen beneath a sky full of cold winter stars. Inside, the lamp on the desk burned with a steady and quiet light, and something between these two people, entirely unplanned and without either of their permissions, took one clear and definitive step forward. Harken moved fast. By the following morning, before a single household servant had finished breakfast, he had written 3 letters and dispatched 2 riders. The first letter went to Mr. Fawcett with precise instructions. The second went to a man named Colonel Asterbrin, a retired military officer and longtime friend, who now sat on the county social board and owed the Duke a favor considerable weight. The third letter was sealed and addressed in Harken's own hand to the chairman of the Magistrates' Assembly, of which Lord Spelton was a sitting member. Mr. Braith watched the riders leave through the front gates at first light, and understood without being told that the Duke had moved from a defensive position to something else entirely. Lettie was in the library when Harken came to find her. She was standing at the window this time rather than sitting, watching frost melt in thin lines down the glass. He crossed the room and stood beside her, both of them looking out at the same frozen courtyard below, and he spoke quietly and with complete directness. "Rufus will expect me to send you away," he said. "Spelton has built his entire strategy on the assumption that I will choose my own comfort over the obligation. He believes reputation will frighten me into removing you before anything is publicly formalized." "And will it?" she asked. No accusation in the question, simply the same honest, open quality she carried into every difficult moment. "No," he said. She looked at him then. "I intend to formalize your position in this household today," he continued, "not merely under my father's arrangement, under my own authority. As a formally sponsored member of this household, your presence here becomes entirely beyond reproach, Legally and socially, Rufus loses the tool he was relying on. She turned back to the window. "That protects me," she said. "What protects you?" "The letters I sent this morning." He paused. "And the truth, Rufus has been working quietly to undermine this house for 4 years. I have known the shape of it. I simply never had a reason compelling enough to act on it directly." He said the next thing without drama, plainly. "You gave me the reason. And the timing." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a housemaid crossed the courtyard carrying a basket, head bent against the cold morning air. The world of the manor moved in its ordinary rhythms below them, entirely unaware of what had shifted inside the house. "Overnight, he will not accept this quietly," she said. "No," Harken agreed. "He will not." He was right. Sir Rufus received the news through a hired contact in the household by midday. Not Braith, who was unbreachable, but a young footman named Dash who had debts that made loyalty a flexible concept. Rufus sat in his rented room at the Greyvale Town Inn and read the short message with his easy smile in place. But his fingers pressed the paper rather hard. He wrote one letter in return, not to Spelton, to a woman named Mrs. Valdecrew, a society columnist of considerable reach who had built a career on the targeted destruction of reputations that powerful people wanted destroyed. He had used her twice before and found her efficient. He outlined no instructions. He simply invited her to Greyvale's county and mentioned that a story of genuine public interest had developed around a certain ducal manor and a young woman of no birth or standing. Mrs. Crew had been doing this long enough to understand exactly what that meant. What Rufus did not account for was Colonel Asterbryn. The colonel arrived at Greyvale by afternoon in a plain traveling coat and the manner of a man who had walked into complicated situations for the better part of 30 years and found most of them manageable. He had served with Harken's elder brother before the brother died of fever in the Eastern campaigns. That history bound the two men with something quieter and considerably stronger than ordinary friendship. He came directly to the study, greeted Harken with one firm handshake, sat down and said, "Tell me everything in the right order." Harken told him. When he finished, Bryn leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way he had always done when organizing a complex problem. "Spelton is the easier of the two," Bryn said. "He is angry, not strategic. His involvement in a private plot against the peer of the realm, in his own county as a sitting magistrate, is the kind of thing that ends a man's public career entirely if it reaches the right ears." "It will reach them," Harken said. "And Rufus is careful," Harken said. "He will not have signed anything or said anything that directly implicates him. The footman Dash can confirm he was here. The conversation at the boundary wall was overheard, but cannot be legally proven." He paused. "What I need is for Rufus to believe he still has a path to success, long enough to take the next step. And I need someone he does not recognize watching when he takes it." Bryn smiled slowly. "You want him to walk himself in." "I want exactly that." In the East Wing, Lettie was not sitting quietly. She had asked Mrs. Pendle for paper and ink and spent 2 hours writing a detailed and carefully worded account of everything she had heard beyond the east garden wall, including the exact phrases both men used, the logical structure of their plan, and her assessment of what each man stood to gain. She signed it, dated it, and asked Mrs. Pendle to have it witnessed by Mr. Braith and Mr. Seal both. It was not a document any court would necessarily act on immediately, but it was the kind of document that, in the right hands at the right moment, became considerably more dangerous than either Rufus or Spelton had allowed for when they stood speaking freely in the cold on the far side of that wall. Mrs. Pendle took the document with both hands and looked at Lettie with an expression that had moved well past the careful warmth of the first morning. "He has not been the same since you arrived," Mrs. Pendle said quietly. Lettie looked at her. "It has been 3 days." "Yes." Mrs. Pendle folded the document with the precision of someone handling something important. 3 days is long enough to see a difference in a man who has not changed in 4 years. She left without further comment, in the manner of a woman who understood that some observations needed no expansion. Lettie stood at the window of her room for a long time after that. She was not a woman given to building elaborate hopes. She had learned early and at real cost what elaborate hopes felt like when they came undone. But there was something beneath the practical structure of everything that had happened since she arrived at these gates, beneath the letter and the legal arrangement and the cold, calculating threat from the other side of the garden wall. Something that she could not classify neatly and had stopped trying to. It sat in the same part of her chest that listened to the silence in a room and understood it. She turned from the window and went to find Harken. She found him in the entrance hall, in quiet conversation with Bryn. Both men looked up. She handed Harken a second copy of the written account, keeping her eyes on his face as he read it. When he reached the end, he looked up at her. "You anticipated that I would want a second copy," he said. "Mr. Fawcett should have one as well," she replied. "And I think Colonel Bryn should keep one." Bryn took it from Harken's hand, read it quickly, and looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "How old are you?" 23, she said. Bryn glanced at Harken. "She thinks like a general." "She thinks clearly," Harken said. It was the most straightforward thing he had said about her to anyone, and all 3 people in the hall understood that it meant considerably more than its plain words carried. The trap was set with a kind of quiet efficiency that leaves no visible seam. Harken let it be known through carefully chosen channels that his household was hosting a small gathering the following evening. Not a grand affair. A dinner, 10 guests, county associates, the sort of modest social occasion that appeared entirely routine. Colonel Bryn arranged for Mrs. Valtecrew, the columnist, to receive an invitation through a mutual contact who had no visible connection to Greyvale. Rufus learned of the gathering the same afternoon. He did not receive an invitation. That absence told him something, and he responded to it exactly as Harken had expected, by accepting a separate invitation to a supper at Lord Spelton's estate that same evening, where both men could receive real-time reports from Dash and plan accordingly. What neither man knew was that Dash had been quietly and honestly spoken to by Mr. Braith the previous afternoon, not threatened, simply informed of the full consequences that historically followed footmen who operated as paid informants within ducal households, and then offered an alternative that required nothing except a return to ordinary loyalty. Dash, who was young and genuinely frightened rather than deeply corrupt, chose the alternative with no hesitation. Everything Rufus sent through Dash now arrived directly to Braith first. The dinner evening arrived gray and cold, with snow beginning to fall lightly by 4 in the afternoon. Mrs. Pendle supervised the preparations with her usual precision, moving through the house with a calm authority that settled the nerves of every junior member of the household. The cook, a broad-armed woman named Mrs. Grote, had been given free rein with the menu and had produced something excellent. Polly and Bess laid the table without being corrected once, which was itself a kind of small miracle. Lettie had not been included in the original dinner plan. She understood this and had made no comment. The formal documentation of her position was complete, but not yet publicly announced, and Harken had been deliberate about protecting her from any exposure before the timing was controlled. But an hour before the guests arrived, he came to the library where she was reading and stood in the doorway. "I would like you to attend this evening," he said. She looked at him carefully. "You are sure?" "I am." He did not explain further. He did not need to. She set her book down. The guests arrived in stages through the snowing evening. There was Sir Thomas Greele and his wife, the county recorder, Mr. Adam Pelf, whose memory for dates and documents was legendary and entirely reliable, 2 members of the Agricultural Trust who held considerable local respect, and Mrs. Valtecrew, who arrived in a dark coat and introduced herself pleasantly and watched everything in the room with a bright, precise attention of a woman who was never simply attending any social occasion, but always working through it. Lettie entered the dining room after the guests were seated. The effect was immediate and entirely controlled. Every eye found her. Harken stood at the head of the table and introduced her with a clarity that left no possible room for social misinterpretation. "Miss Lettie Crane," he said, "is under the formal protection and sponsorship of this household by arrangement of my late father, and confirmed 2 days ago by Mr. Fawcett of Fawcett and Associates, whom many of you will know. She is a guest of Greyvale in every formal and honorable sense of that word." Mrs. Crew's pen was not visible, but something moved behind her eyes that was clearly writing. Mr. Adam Pelf nodded with the satisfied expression of a man who appreciated when legal clarity was used as a social instrument. Sir Thomas Greel's wife looked at Lettie with open and genuine curiosity. Lettie met every gaze quietly and directly, seated herself, and spoke when spoken to with a composed and thoughtful manner that had always been as natural to her as breathing. Across the county, at Lord Spelton's supper table, Dash's first report arrived confirming the guest list. Rufus read it, noted Mrs. Crew's name, and went very still. He had invited that woman for a specific purpose, and she was now sitting inside Greyvale's dining room with the Duke publicly establishing the young woman's legitimate position in full view of a county recorder and 2 respected local figures. He understood immediately. The trap had closed before he even recognized its shape. Spelton was still reading the report when Rufus stood from the supper table and said he needed air. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow falling in the dark, and for the first time in 4 years of careful, patient work, he had no clear next move. Spelton came to stand beside him. "We still have options," he said. "Name one," Rufus replied. Neither man found an answer. The dinner at Greyvale ended late, warm, and with the quiet success of an evening that had accomplished considerably more than any guest fully understood. Mrs. Crew departed with the material for a column that would place the Duke of Greyvale in a thoroughly respectable light and make any subsequent gossip about Lettie Crane look precisely like what it was, a manufactured attack from people with visible personal grievances. When the last carriage had rolled down the lane, Harken stood at the top of the entrance steps and watched the lanterns disappear through the snow. The grounds were entirely white now. The world outside Greyvale's walls was cold and dark, and full of the kind of people who moved against things they could not own. Inside, the house was warm and lit and entirely intact. He heard her step behind him. She stood a little apart, wrapped in a shawl, looking out at the same white grounds. "It is not finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "Rufus does not stop. He will find a new angle. Then we will find a first," she said simply. He turned to look at her. The snow fell between them and around them the quiet, steady way of a world that had no urgency about anything and intended to continue regardless. She looked back at him with the same directness she had carried since the moment she placed her worn traveling bag on the stone steps and waited for a gate to open. He thought about the letter in his coat. He thought about 6 lines his father had written 11 years ago and kept sealed until exactly this moment. He thought about the particular quality of silence in a room when 2 people could share it without either one needing to fill it. He thought about 4 years of closed gates and turned away carriages and a coldness that had never been coldness at all, but something else entirely, something that had simply needed a reason to become something else. He said nothing. But he did not look away, and she, who had learned to read the things people most needed to say and could not quite reach, understood exactly what the silence meant. Mrs. Pendle, watching from an upper window with her hands folded, breathed out quietly and said nothing at all to anyone. Old Tomas, locking the great gates at the end of the lane, looked back once at the manor lights burning in the snow, and thought what it thought since the morning that worn traveling bag hit these stone steps. that some arrivals announce themselves like thunder, and some arrive so quietly that you only understand what they changed long after the gate has swung shut behind them. Inside the study, Mr. Braith drafted a careful note to Mr. Fawcett. Colonel Bryn was already composing his separate report to the magistrates' assembly regarding Lord Spelton's conduct. The footman Dash had been moved to a different position in the household, quietly and without drama. The wheels of consequence were turning in their slow and reliable way, as they always do for people who mistake cruelty for strategy and silence for weakness. The snow fell on Greyvale Manor all through that night. By morning it had covered everything, and the ground were clean and unmarked and entirely still. The cold duke, who had turned every noble bride away from his gate, had not said a single word about love, or the future, or what came next. But the gate was open. It had been open since the morning when a young woman with a worn bag and a letter stood outside it, and waited with the patience of someone who understood the difference between a locked door and one that simply had not been opened yet. Now the questions settled quietly over the story like snow over stone. Will Sir Rufus truly accept defeat? Or is a man who has spent 4 years dismantling something from the inside ever truly finished? What did those 6 lines from the late Duke Aldous say? The lines that moved a man not easily moved. The lines Harken has carried close to his chest from the moment he read them. What does Lord Spelton do when a man of his particular anger finds every door closing in front of him at once? Was Mrs. Pendle right? That 3 days is long enough to see a change in a man who has not changed in 4 years? And what becomes of 2 people who learn to share silence before they learn to share anything else? In a house that had been closed for so long the walls themselves had forgotten what warmth felt like. Most of all, what do you do when the one person who finally sees through you is the one person in the world that should never have been let inside at all? Kindly drop your thoughts in the comments.